Welcome to another episode of Myeloma Matters, the podcast dedicated to empowering myeloma patients and their caregivers with practical information and inspiring stories from patients and their caregivers. I'm your host, Christopher Pena, Director of Educational Programs at the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Whether you're a patient or supporting a loved one on this journey, we're here to bring you hope, understanding, and actionable insights to navigate life with multiple myeloma. I'm really excited today because we're actually diving into a rapidly evolving area of myeloma treatment, immunotherapy. And we're going to be focusing on two groundbreaking approaches, one called CAR T-cell therapy and another called bispecific antibody therapy. These therapies are changing myeloma care, offering new hope for patients whose treatment no longer works. I'll dive a little bit deeper into CAR T-cell therapy, and it involves reprogramming a patient's own immune cells to recognize and attack myeloma cells with precision. So to do this, T-cells are collected from a patient, genetically modified in a lab to turn them into CAR T-cells, which takes about 4 to 6 weeks, and then they're reinfused back into the patient after the patient undergoes lymphodepleting chemotherapy, which is done to remove white blood cells and make room for the newly engineered CAR T-cells. The infusion process occurs at a treatment center, and subsequent monitoring and recovery is usually done in a hospital setting, which takes about 4 weeks. So some approved CAR T-cell therapies include Carvecti or cilta-cel, and that's for patients who have had at least one line of treatment. And the other is called Abecma or ide-cel, and this is for patients who have had at least 2 prior lines of therapy. Now, shifting gears and talking about bispecific antibodies, these are proteins that are designed to target and destroy myeloma cells by connecting them to your immune system's T cells. So currently, we have Tecvayli, which is known as teclistamab, Elrexfio, which is known as elranatamab, and Talvey, also known as talquetamab. These are bispecific antibodies that are approved for patients who have had at least 4 or more prior lines of therapy. These bispecific antibodies have shown promising results in treating relapsed or refractory multiple myeloma. Now, bispecific antibody is administered to myeloma patients through intravenous infusion. You typically start with a low dose of the therapy and you gradually increase it over several days or weeks. And that allows the body to adjust and reduce the risk of side effects. This is known as step-up dosing. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the details with either CAR T-cell therapy or bispecific antibody therapy, please visit our website, the mmrf.org, and do a search for myeloma fast facts. These are one-page documents that have a lot of relevant information regarding either CAR T or bispecifics and a lot of the material that we're covering here today. So I'm excited to bring some patients today to talk about the decisions they faced when considering these treatments, the way that they prepared mentally, physically, and emotionally, and overall what their treatment experience has been like. So joining us today are 3 guests: Andrew, who received CAR T-cell therapy; Bill, who received both CAR T-cell therapy and bispecific antibody therapies; and Gail, who has received 2 bispecific antibody therapies. So Andrew, Bill, and Gail will share their stories and offer their firsthand perspectives on how to approach these treatments. So by sharing insights on what to expect during treatment or noting which resources and support systems that prove to be most helpful, this conversation will help provide you with a roadmap for navigating these therapies with confidence when you discuss them with your provider. So without further ado, Andrew, Bill, Gail, thank you so much for joining our podcast and sharing your stories and experiences. The MMRF's Patient Navigation Center receives so many emails and calls about CAR T-cell therapy and bispecifics. So I know our listeners today will be really interested in learning from your experiences. So I'll kick it off with my first question to you, Andrew. You received the CAR T-cell therapy called Carvecti. Could you walk us through what led you to that decision?
It really wasn't much of a decision for me by the time we got there, and let me explain why. I received my initial myeloma treatment in 2013 and 2014, and after that I was in remission for an extended period of time. I relapsed in December of 2023, and when I relapsed, it was in a very rare and odd way. The myeloma was not in my bone marrow, it was in my central nervous system, which is, as I said, very rare. and only 1 to 2% of myeloma patients have it in their central nervous system. Because it's so rare, there's no real established treatment protocol for how to deal with it. So my team of doctors, which included multiple hematologist oncologists, a radiation oncologist, and neurosurgeon, came up with a plan where I would receive systemic chemotherapy. I would receive what's also called intrathecal chemotherapy, which is injected through a port under my scalp into my spine, and also radiation to try and get this under control. But the plan always was, once it got under control, to go to CAR T, because there really was no other way that they thought that we could get ahead of this. So it wasn't a difficult decision. CAR T was always in the plan from the very beginning.
Thanks for sharing that with us. And so I know we have some listeners who may be experiencing extramedullary disease or something along those lines. So it's really helpful to hear what had happened before you got to that point with CAR T cell therapy. So thanks for sharing that. Now, Bill, you also received Carvykti. What was that decision process like?
Similar in nature to Andrew as well. I mean, that was a plan of where we're going to get to at the end state at some point. I was diagnosed originally in 2008. I had my first transplant in 2013. I was 5 years in remission. Relapsed in 2018, and went on to daratumumab, doing the first immunotherapy on that side. Then COVID hit, and we had to pull off of one of the drugs, and they put me on another oral drug. So I was only in the hospital, once a month, as opposed to 3 times a month. Out of the blue, in 2021, I reached remission. So it was not expected with the therapy I was getting. When we got there, checking the bone marrow biopsy, I still had, a very, very small number of cells. So we switched to see if we can get from that small number to zero. Unfortunately, it doubled. So we switched to a different drug, and then fortunately, then it tripled. So the disease was coming back. It was just a matter of not presenting as an M spike yet. So the doc finally said, "Look, you've been 5 years doing some sort of treatment. Let's take a break and give you time off. Let your body heal, get as strong as it can on its own." And then in February 2024, mine relapsed normally, but with a lot more lytic lesions than I had experienced in the past. It started with understanding a numbness in my chin, which when we did an MRI, immediately started to notice flare-ups, basically back at the rear of the jawline. Then we went, a PET scan, and it was all throughout, T3 vertebrae and all throughout the ribs and so on and so forth. So we knew that the plan was going to be Carvykti. My doc happened to be one of the lead researchers, for Carvykti as well. So, I have no doubt in his decision making on that process.
All right. So just as a follow-up question, once you knew about Carvykti, how did you prepare for it?
I prepared for it similar in nature, or I tried to do a little research, but similar in nature to the original stem cell transplant I did in 2013. I knew I was going to be in the hospital. I knew I would be in the hospital for 2 weeks. What was the plan? What did I need to do? What did I do last time that I wanted to do differently? The side effects are completely different, but I was in the hospital twice because I did the bispecific, and I know we're going to talk about that later on as well, but I did the bispecific as a bridging therapy to bring down the disease before I went in for the Carvykti. But just knowing I was going to be in the hospital for 2 to 3 weeks, what was my plan of keeping myself sane? How was I going to keep myself active, and doing things? That was the one thing I learned from my stem cell transplant, is that, you need to be walking to keep yourself from literally atrophy, and not being able to walk up the block, which was the biggest impact I had after 2013.
So that's a really interesting point you bring up. I know that there's some people who may have had some stem cell transplants and then they go into some type of relapse, or they're refractory to their current treatment. So one last follow-up with that, would you say that that was really helpful in preparing you for Carvykti, just having that stem cell transplant, and not so much from like a treatment point of view, but as a preparation point of view, or as a mental preparation point of view?
I treated it the same way. With the stem cell transplant, you were collecting, I harvest over 3 days, pulling out the stem cells that I could for that. With this, I was over 4 hours. I was lucky enough. Apparently, I had very good veins, so I actually had a 17 gauge needle in my arm to extract my T cells for the Carvykti, which You couldn't bend your elbow because it's a giant needle going in your arm. But I didn't have to worry about getting a port done, so I didn't have to do that process. But as you waited the 8 weeks for it to be prepped and ready to go, you're putting yourself in a mental state of what you're going to have to do. Again, I was in the hospital for 10 days with the bispecific prior to that, so I had sort of a plan of what things are going to work like at that point too.
And Andrew, just a similar question. Once you knew of your treatment plan about Carvecti, how did you prepare for that?
Well, there's really two aspects to that from my standpoint. One was getting myself ready, but the other challenge for me was the hospital where I was getting the CAR T is about 100 miles from my house, and you can't be that far away after the initial hospitalization. So I had to arrange to be, I live in central Pennsylvania, to be in Philadelphia for 5 or 6 weeks. Mentally, that was really difficult to wrap my head around. But what I learned was that Janssen, the maker of Carvicti, has a patient support program. And my doctor connected me with them. You have to qualify for the program. I'm not sure what the qualifications are, but somehow I qualified. And they were tremendous. They arranged for and paid for a hotel nearby. They gave us money for meals. They paid for transportation. That just took a huge load off of our minds in addition to helping to pay for it. That was very, very important, and I would urge anyone who is getting CAR T who doesn't live near the center to explore whether there's patient support programs available.
Great. And a follow-up question to that, how did you become aware of the patient support program?
I got my CAR T therapy at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. They are also one of the premier centers for CAR T. They do a lot of CAR T there. They have a CAR T coordinator there. That's her whole job, is coordinating the whole CAR T process for their patients. And she's the one who told me about it and hooked me up with the support program. And the support program took it from there. And like I said, just tremendous, tremendous people to work with.
Great. And I think that's perfect advice for anybody listening. And, if there is a patient coordinator, don't be afraid to ask these questions about resources or anything along those lines so you can have that support throughout the entire time you're on CAR T or any other treatment for that matter. Bill, switching gears a little bit, you received a bispecific antibody, Talvey, before you received the CAR T cell therapy, Carvecti. And this protocol is treatment center specific, so at Mount Sinai, not broadly followed. Can you share some thoughts on that treatment decision?
When the discussion of what to do next came up, it was always one or the other. When we finally got down to actually time to do something, again, I flared up drastically. So I had a lot of lytic lesions and massive bone pain right between the shoulder blades, small pains elsewhere. I thought it was muscular in nature, and it turns out that it was not. And it was just lit up. No exposure, so I didn't have to worry about it actually breaking through into the bone, but it was inside the bone marrow. You could see that it was lighting up everywhere on the PET scan. When it came down to what are we going to do as a bridging therapy, they brought up doing the bispecific antibody as a bridging therapy. I'm trusting my doctor on what he thinks is the best way to do it. I knew both of these in my head are what I consider to be near cures, things that are going to take us so far along compared to, say, for example, the stem cell transplant that I did back in the day. These are things that I think will carry us for the next 10 years. I understood generally the difference between the bispecific antibody, that is, just it's something that knows to attach to the cancer cells, versus the Carvicti, which is actually genetically engineered specifically for me. So I understood the difference between the two. I was blown away by the impact of the bispecific. I literally was in remission in 8 days.
Wow. And so, what's interesting, you bring up that point about bridging therapy. And I know for our listeners that are looking at these kinds of sections within the patient treatment journey and thinking about, what's out there. In this case, and in your case, Bill, it was a bispecific, but just want to put a plug in for a webinar that the MMRF will have on some promising data presented at the American Society for Hematology conference this past December. And there's some very unique studies that look at options for bridging therapy in your experience as well. So just want to encourage our listeners to check that out because there's a lot of really neat things on the horizon. And Bill, for you obviously saw what that impact was. So thanks for sharing that. So let's bring Gail into our discussion. Gail, you've tried 2 different bispecific antibodies, both in the setting of a clinical trial. And can you share what led you to enroll in a clinical trial?
Oh, well, I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma in 2019. And from there, in 2020, I had a stem cell transplant. And it worked for a while, but then my numbers started going up, I would say sometime in late 2021, and by 2022, they were really increasing. And so because of that, the doctor who did the initial stem cell, he's like, oh, you have to have another one. And I was like, not a chance. I knew that if I did it the first time, it didn't barely lasted a year. It wasn't going to last longer after I did it again. So I went to the Mayo Clinic and we spoke to experts. When I say we, my husband and I, we spoke to experts at the Mayo Clinic, and they agreed with me that having another stem cell would be a waste of time. And my husband is very active as far as MMRF. He really knows it more. I just show up, but he knows everything. So he spoke to the folks at MMRF, and they recommended that I try a program at Mount Sinai. That's the spring of 2022. Initially, I had to go to the hospital for 3 days. They test, and you go the next week, you're there for 3 days, and then you go back another week for 3 days, and they test and see if you're going to have any sort of reaction. I only had a reaction the second time. I was nauseous, but other than that, I didn't. However, we were in California, and I think it was June or July, and I had a small mass behind my left ear. We realized that the treatment wasn't working. And by the end of, I would say, October, November, I had a huge mass under my ear, and that just literally grew from my ear all the way to my shoulder. Then I had another mass on top of my right shoulder. They did some temporarily, and it went away for a little bit, but then it just wasn't working. So right before Christmas, I was put on the second bispecific. It worked. And just know this about me. When I saw those things on my neck, I was not a happy camper. And when I went to the hospital, and my husband told him, listen, she doesn't care. All she wants is those things off her neck. And when the team came in, the first thing I said, well, is there plastic surgery or something like that? But I didn't need it. It went down naturally. I also tell you, I've always eaten healthily, and I have always exercised. So I think that made a big difference. And my attitude, I've always had attitude that, yeah, I have it, and that's it. And I think that's made a difference in my recovery.
That's awesome. And I really appreciate you for talking about these different elements of supportive care. And again, another MMRF shameless plug in here, but we actually had a podcast a couple of weeks ago on elements of supportive care. So looking at people's mental health, their attitude, and some of the things you mentioned, working out and exercising, and really paying attention to diet and how those things just play a really important role in not only just adhering to treatment, but getting the best possible outcome for you as a patient, in terms of your treatment goals. So really glad that you brought that up. So, going back to your story, at the time that you did, started seeing these masses and everything, and you were considering your options, was a bispecific antibody the only option at the time, or were other treatments considered?
There were other things. They gave us a list, but the doctors thought that bispecific, especially my doctor, who I presently have, Dr. Usmani, that would be the best route for me. And it worked for maybe a couple of months, but then after that, my numbers started going up again.
What guidance would you give other patients either preparing for a bispecific or for a clinical trial?
I would say just keep an open mind and keep being positive that things will work out. I'm the kind of person that just doesn't dwell on stuff. And I will just, okay, so let's try this, see what it happens. I've never been, oh my God, what's going to happen, blah, blah, blah. It's just not who I am as a person. And I do think having a positive attitude, and my husband's like this, he says this about me, if I lose my arm, we're just kidding. If I lose my arm, I'm like, yeah, but I have another one and I'll learn how to write. If it's my dominant arm, I'll learn how to write with my left. That's pretty much the way I roll. And not giving in to the disease. Don't let it define you as a person. I know it's difficult, but that's very important.
Great. Thanks for that advice. And this is a really good segue into the next part of our conversation here, which is you had mentioned your husband. So we're going to move on and discuss the important role of caregivers and patient advocates. Having a caregiver or patient advocate is very important for people with myeloma. A caregiver, like a family member, friend, or spouse, helps with things like going to a doctor's appointment or keeping track of medication and making sure the patient eats well and obtains plenty of rest. A patient advocate can also help speak up for the patient to make sure that they're getting the care that they need. Bill, you had mentioned your wife during your treatment, so I'd love to get your thoughts on how that was for you in terms of caregivers.
I think your wife, your kids, any immediate family, it's a double-edged sword. I'm extremely outspoken and I'm very much like Gail, very active about, what am I getting? Why am I getting it? What does this mean? What are the results there? I'm also very outspoken in regards to on social media about what I was going through, these side effects and all that. My wife is not outspoken at all, but she's a huge support because she also has to take up the slack, whether that be the dog, the kids, any of the stuff that's going on at home. There's a support that you're getting on that side that, it was fantastic. I mean, when she came by, when she could come by, she always made a way to help me out. I didn't need her in the case of the advocate because I was the advocate myself and actually knew more about those things, dealing with friends and trying to, keep them at bay and not bothering me about questions or how can I help, Bill? They those kinds of things. So, but what I've always said on the caregiver side is that it's important you as the patient realize that they are the caregiver. And as much stress as you might go through, it's extremely important that the caregiver has the opportunity to blow off some steam.
That's a great point in terms of there also being a support system for caregivers as well, them being ancillary to the patient and everything that's going along. So thanks for bringing that up. Andrew, how crucial is having a caregiver by your side during the CAR T-cell treatment process?
It's indispensable. I mean, I was in Philadelphia away from my home for almost 6 weeks. You were required to have someone with you 24 hours a day when you were not in the hospital. So after the first 10 days when I was released from the hospital, we were staying in a hotel and I couldn't drive, but I also couldn't be alone. So I had to have a caregiver with me all the time. And there's just no two ways about it. But to back up a little bit, my wife has been with me the whole time since 2013, going to appointments, but she was there as another set of ears because sometimes I would hear something and maybe I didn't hear it quite right. And she also took notes. I was cleaning up my office the other day and I found reams of notes from all our appointments over the last 11 years that she had taken. And sometimes it's really helpful to go back over those if there's something that we didn't remember. So I just can't say enough how important that is to have someone by your side, whether, like you were saying earlier, whether it's a spouse or a child or a friend. You really can't do this alone.
Very true. And I like that analogy, another set of ears. So, and I think that this is just really great broad advice for anybody listening in, for caregivers as well. Take those notes at every appointment and importantly, keep a log of them because you never know when you're going to have to refer back. I'm glad that we were able to talk about the importance of caregivers. Now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about treatments and side effects. And so I have some general questions and we'll start with you, Andrew. Could you briefly share what side effects concerned you and your care team and how you plan to address them?
So the primary side effects historically of CAR T are high fever and neurological side effects. That's why they keep you in the hospital for a certain period of time, in my case, 10 days. to be able to see whether you were having any of those side effects, and if so, control them. And I mean, I was certainly concerned about that, of course. Fortunately for me, I didn't really have those side effects. I had different side effects, which they had never heard of. And so they weren't sure exactly how to deal with it. And that was, I just had this pain down the backs of my legs. It almost felt like your hamstrings were tight and you just couldn't get them loose. So we thought maybe that was because I was in the hospital for an extended period of time and wasn't as active as I normally am. Just walking around the hospital floor didn't seem to be doing the trick. Once I was released from the hospital and went back to the hotel and could be more active and go to the gym at the hotel, it was still there. And it confounded them a little bit. And they gave me different medications. And over time, it went away. But that was the primary side effect that I actually experienced, and one that they really weren't familiar with.
And that's a really great point in terms of every patient's journey is unique. So sometimes there may be some side effects that may not happen as common as with others. So thanks for sharing that. Bill, could you briefly share what side effects concerned you, how your care team planned to address them, and what it was like when you did have your side effects?
Again, I've been dealing with this since 2008. The side effects for any of the drugs that I've taken have never been large. Maybe tired, maybe some gastro issues not being regular, things of that nature. But I've never had like the nausea or any of those other things. So I've considered myself very lucky in that respect. And when I started the bispecific, I went in on Tuesday, got a small dose. Thursday, got a slightly larger dose. Saturday, got I think half of a dose, and Sunday was writhing in pain. That area behind my back, they upped me to 10 milligrams of oxy. Monday, there was no pain. On Wednesday, I had blood work done and there was no cancer. It was just mind blowing how quickly it happened. However, they also gave me all of these lotions and other things to put on to protect your skin. And you may lose your nails, you may lose your skin, you may lose taste, you may lose all the different things that you always see that are written out on the or the part that they talk really quickly for the commercial at the end, right? I got all of them. I got every single one. For about 4.5 months, I couldn't taste anything. I could pour a packet of salt on my tongue and I couldn't taste it. I couldn't eat meat. I couldn't eat chicken. It was like chewing cardboard, is what it was like. I lost all the skin on my hands. I lost every single fingernail. I peeled all the skin off of my feet. I had a rash in the groin region that was the first couple days I got home. So, I mean, everything that could go wrong went wrong. Again, no nausea, none of the typical chemo type side effects, but just bizarre side effects like that. And the skin process was weeks in length. So I was going back to the office wearing like white gloves because I would be shedding, and I'd have to cut the fingers off because I couldn't use a phone or couldn't use a mouse pad, a trackpad, at work. So it was very, very difficult, but more cosmetic in nature. There was no pain, but I was trying to explain why you're wearing gloves or trying to explain why you're shedding like a snake. So it was a very bizarre circumstance. Again, my wife hated it, but I was extremely open about it. It was all over Instagram and showing what it looked like. But I also do a lot of fundraising for the MRF too. So that was part of my ability to sort of say, I'm proving the numbers that you donate are working. I reached remission in 8 days. Yes, I had these side effects. This is the stuff people goes through. On the Carvicti side, because I think we killed the cancer outright, when I went in for the Carvicti a month later, I had no side effects. They kept saying you're going to have a fever. I did have the fever. The bispecific, I had that fever on the 5th day like they expected. But on day 5, nothing. On day 9, nothing. On day 11, nothing. And they finally said, okay, I don't think anything's going to happen. So I didn't have any side effect whatsoever on the Carvicti. But I think that's partially because I had such a good reaction that there was no cancer to fight. There's nothing else that was going on that side. So the only issue that I've had from, at this point now is my neutrophil counts. The ANC number is still low. So I'm having to get some sort of a Zarzio shot on a, bi-monthly basis to keep my T cells up.
And are there any other prophylactic things to prevent from infections or anything along those lines?
I'm getting IVIG once a month, so I'm getting an update on that side too.
Got it.
I wasn't prepared for the fact that the CAR T would result in very extremely low blood counts. And in fact, my platelets went down to 7, which is almost not there. And I had to receive, I think, about a dozen bags of platelet transfusions to try and get that back up. I also had very low white blood counts and neutrophils and had to get all kinds of treatments for that. And in fact, now, I mean, I had my CAR T in August. We're talking in January of the next year. My counts still aren't up to normal. I mean, I'm functioning fine and I don't really have any side effects, but that was something I really wasn't prepared for.
Yeah, I'll couple that too. I had my CAR T in June, and my numbers are still not there. But the other part that I found was that the red blood cells specifically took. I. It's almost like all the your body was going back to work, focusing on one job only: kill the disease. The disease wasn't there, didn't know what to do, but it was not doing the normal things for the body. So I got 2 iron infusions to try to make up for the fact that I wasn't getting my red blood cell counts up. And so I found that impacting me trying to jog. I couldn't run more than 3 or 4 city blocks, and I'd have to start walking because I didn't have enough oxygen coming through the body because my red blood cell counts were so low. But that's a really good call. I think that was the same thing that happened to me, is that I found that those numbers started to drop down.
Yes, Gail, please share what it was like for you.
I had most of my side effects with the stem cell, actually. And about the weakness, I could barely walk up the stairs. Fortunately, it was during COVID, so I was already isolated because no one could be around me. I couldn't have any foods that were from the outside. And so friends, because it's just my husband and I rarely cook, but friends were making fresh things for us so that I would have food, so on and so forth. The only side effects, which was significant, were the masses because it was no longer working. And I got sick on maybe the second time I had to go to the hospital for 3 days, but barely, nothing significant. I have a respiratory thing that goes on. Like, you hear my voice now, it sounds a little hoarse. That's been, I'd say, for the last year and a half or so ago. I cough a lot, and but it's usually when I first wake up or when I go to bed. That's because I'm lying down, I guess. But I have phlegm that comes up all the time. That happens a lot. And my nose is running. Usually in the morning, my nose is running. But that's a small price to pay because my M spike level is almost 0. So I'm fine with that. And as long as I don't have any growths on my body, I'm good with, having a runny nose or something like that. But I've been lucky. I've never had anything significant. I think, if I'm not mistaken, when I had the first clinical trial, I did have a fever for a couple of days, but nothing significant, and it went down, and I haven't had a fever since. And I was released from the hospital in December of 2023, right before Christmas. I spent about 10 days in the hospital with the trial bispecific, and that was it. I've been good ever since.
So you mentioned that your N spike levels went to 0, your masses were gone, and this goes into the next question. How else has your treatment plan made an impact on you?
I get treated every 2 weeks, so I have to schedule around it. I was supposed to have this treatment this Tuesday. However, I had an event to go to, and I knew this treatment would take a while because I'm getting the IVIG, and that's more than just a half hour or something. So I changed it. I'm always conscious of that, but other than that, it really, I worked my schedule around it.
Other aspects of your life where there was an impact in addition to that you want to share?
I retired from the authority as their trial person. I ran the trial division in-house outside counsel, and also I would try one major case a year. But once I left, I was hired by outside counsel to try cases because folks don't like trying cases and so on and so forth. It's very labor intensive and mentally intensive. And last year I tried a case of verdict, won, so on and so forth. So as far as that, because things had slowed down, obviously during COVID, the courthouse was closed, so trials were slowly coming back. My trial skills are still sharp, so I'm good. I'm a fashionista. I'm still very stylish. If you see my Facebook page, it says fashion influencer. I still do that. So as I said, I'm fine.
That's awesome, Gail. Thanks for sharing that with us. And Bill, how has your treatment plan made an impact?
My treatment plan, my goal would be that I can get to a point where I'm only going in for checkups. Because my numbers have been low, I have Zarzio or Neupogen in the fridge here at home. I can go to the hospital, get the numbers checked, go home. If my ANC is below 1, I'll take the shot myself, and then I'll go on to the next week. Gail, like you, I get an IVIG, once a month too. So next Friday is my IVIG sitting. So you're 4.5 hours in a chair. But yeah, I think I would like to get to the point where I can be self-sufficient, no longer needing the IVIG, and really just coming into checkups. That's where I'd like to be. I'm fine with the treatment plan as it is. My company is very flexible with my being able to work from home.
Andrew, how has your treatment plan made an impact?
Well, it's interesting because for a long time between when I was initially diagnosed and went through my induction and stem cell transplant, I had no treatment for about 8.5 years. And then once I relapsed, I went into heavy duty treatment where I was getting all the therapies that I mentioned earlier. And my calendar was full of appointments for treatment, for scans, for doctor's visits. And once I had the CAR T, and understand, before I had the CAR T, my numbers there was nothing there. It was undetectable. I had the CAR T, and so I went through restaging 3 months after, which was a few months ago, and there was nothing there. So now we're sort of in a hiatus where I'm not getting any treatment. And it's really sort of a weird thing to deal with because I don't have all these appointments on my calendar. And at least for medical treatment, believe it or not, that has taken some getting used to. But because of the rarity of what I have now, no one really knows what the future holds in terms of treatment. I mean, right now, I'm going to get restaged again in March, and we'll see what, if anything, shows up. And if nothing shows up, then I'm assuming we'll go another 3 months. It's been sort of life getting back to complete normal. Although the whole time I was going through treatment, I made my life as normal as it could possibly be. I'm semi-retired, but I continued to work throughout. I did my exercise plan religiously and just lived my life. So I really tried to not let it affect my life as much as possible.
I think that's a really great piece of advice in terms of everything you just said. Try to live it normal and not let it impact you as much. So, Andrew, Bill, and Gail, thank you all for sharing your experiences. And while we're on that subject of advice, do any of you have any final pieces of advice for listeners that are really considering these treatments?
I would say it's very important, as the gentleman indicated, you need to have an advocate, even if you're mouthy and so on and so forth. It's good to have someone else there just in case, because I have no problems advocating for myself, but it's nice to have someone else also. I just think you're treated better, and the treatment, they'll listen more if they go, there are two people here. It's a united front. I agree with Andrew in the sense that never let the disease define you and take over your life. You really have to, and even when you're going through a lot of stuff, you really just have to keep going, go through it, and hope for the best. And a positive attitude, I really think, helps with your recovery.
I'm part of the MMRF's mentor program, and they refer patients to us to talk to. Several weeks ago, I talked to a patient whose doctor was strongly recommending that they get CAR T. And this patient was dubious about it, concerned about it, probably didn't want to do it. But he went to the MMRF mentor page, got matched up with me, and we talked through it. And by the time we were done with that conversation, I think he understood why CAR T might well be the best thing for him, and it wasn't something to be afraid of. If your doctor is recommending CAR T or bispecifics, it would be a good idea to talk to someone who's been through that, and they can help you understand what's involved and prepare for it.
Yeah, I was going to add similar kind of a comment, is that the MRF has a massive amount of material, information that can help you understand. And whether that be signing up for the mentor program or just understanding when the doctor gives you these are the treatment plans available to you, understanding what they are, even if you can't understand this yourself. Miguel's point, having an advocate there that can help you, somebody that can take that burden off of you and understand it. Because I think that if you don't have an understanding of why they're telling you to go down this path, Miguel's point, she was not having a good result with this one thing, having the courage to turn around and go somewhere else, find somebody else. But you have to be able to educate yourself enough to understand why you're trying to make that decision and why, from a common sense perspective, what that person is saying just doesn't make sense. So the MRF has a huge amount of information that can help you educate yourself. You have to put on a little bit of your Dr. Jekyll in order to deal with Mr. Hyde.
I would agree. And I agree about MMRF. My husband was the one who discovered the organization. Once my husband got in contact with them, he started talking and picking their brains. And through that, it led us to, okay, try this, try that. That's not working. And they had me do a video for them, I think it was in 2023 when I got out of the hospital, explaining my experience. It's about 4 or 5 people that they set up these videos and just what it's like, because it can appear overwhelming. You have to, not only the positive attitude, but also, I agree, do your research and see if this is the right thing for you.
Terrific. I think education equals empowerment, and I think this is all really great advice that everybody's been touching on. So I think that's a perfect way to end this. So I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode of the Myeloma Matters podcast on bispecific antibodies and CAR T-cell therapy, hosted by the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. The MMRF thanks Gail, Andrew, and Bill for sharing their unique perspectives and insights. And we also want to thank AbbVie, Amgen, Cure, Genentech, GSK, Johnson & Johnson, Karyopharm, Legend Biotech, Pfizer, Regeneron, and Sanofi for their generous support of this podcast. The information in this podcast is not intended to replace the services or advice of trained healthcare professionals. If you have any questions about what you heard today, especially regarding these 2 therapies, please call the MMRF Patient Navigation Center at 1-888-841-6673. If you've enjoyed this series, be sure to leave a comment or review wherever you get your podcasts. This is Christopher Pena from the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, wishing you all strength and hope. Until next time, thank you.